What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Ink Master Critiques. We are now on episode 6, and this is where we all got to tattoo service dogs. Now, I think I speak for all of us when we say this was a nice change of pace, and we all needed a little puppy love. Having these dogs in our station the entire time was super nice, especially after our brains were fried after the last few weeks. So let's jump right into it and check some of these out. Once again, welcome back. Before we get started, I've got merch. It's me! We have this design and so many others in the store below this video, or you can also click the link in the description below. I asked my friend Sabrina, who is actually a director for Disney Animation, to help me out with these designs. She is a phenomenal artist, and you've probably seen some of her work without even knowing it. And I would really love it if you could support her as well. All you gotta do is go give her a follow. Thank you once again so much, Sabrina, and you guys, please check out the store. All right, let's get to the first one. All right, first up, we've got Anthony's dog, Kai. And my first impressions with this tattoo are, I do wish it were a little smaller so it fit the arm better. But for not being a black and gray artist and for doing his first ever pet portrait on this competition, he really managed to capture some nice smooth shades. As I said before, I think the size of this thing kind of makes it look a little strange and a little warped, and I do think it would have looked a lot more like the dog had it been sized down just a bit. When I tattoo portraits or dogs, I break everything down into shapes. So when I see the shapes that Anthony put into this thing, they are a bit off. Like if we look to the left of the snout, there are some darker areas mixed with some lighter areas, and when we look at the reference, those are all generally just one, maybe two tones. The tongue, I think, unfortunately fell victim to the same sort of thing, where in the reference there is very subtle tonal changes, and in the tattoo there's two, maybe three different sort of shades. To the right of the tongue, where there is that big white glare, I think that should have been shaded a bit lighter, but that does take time and practice. If that's something that you're not used to doing, you can make things dark really fast. The shading around the hairs on the snout are a bit thick. I do think that could have been tightened up a bit more. And just to the left of the nose, he's got that dark shading in there where on the reference it really isn't that dark, so it just makes the nose look kind of weird. But again, this is his first attempt at a dog portrait, and I'm sure he's used to doing things a lot bigger, so this was probably pretty small for him. I'm sure if he had a few more cracks at this, he'd learn real quick, because he is Anthony Tex after all. Up next, we've got Kat with her service dog, Maggie. Now right away, this is a very striking portrait photo. You can tell this is definitely what Kat does on a normal basis. She managed to capture the direction and flow of all this hair, which is a very hard thing to do. The eyes are gorgeous. The one eye does look a little light compared to the reference, but on that note, I do think that these reference photos that we were sent are a little darker than what we were using. Side note. But that being said, there's not much to pick apart on this one. The whiskers turned out great, all these shadows turned out wonderful, and the fact that she decided to use a circle on this portrait in itself is a very hard thing to do. I love the attention to detail that she brought below the nose. It just adds a lot of nice texture. If we are comparing this directly to the reference in which we're working with, I do think the right of the face could have been a tad darker. But again, I think the references that we're working with are a bit darker than what we had. Even if we look at the whites on the reference, they are a bit blown out, so I really don't think that's what she was working with. I could be wrong. But overall, killer job, Kat. You definitely deserve tattoo of the day. All right, up next we've got Joseph with his service dog, Andy. Now I did catch that Joseph's client initially wanted a colored portrait, but they settled on just doing colored eyes, which you know is one of my favorite things in the world. We're just gonna write sarcasm right here. This is one of my biggest pet peeves, no pun intended. When it comes to any kind of portrait, just having colored eyes makes it look weird no matter how well it's executed. I do think Joseph could have used some more burnt oranges or darker oranges in those eyes to really set them off, if they were going to go with colored eyes. Because as it sits, it just looks a little stale and they don't pop that much. And it's not technically photo accurate. Ryan mentioned that she wished Joseph had brought that yellow into the tag as well, and I gotta say I agree. It would just really bring this thing around full circle. I think my biggest problem with this tattoo is right above the lips where he has this large area of skin tone, and if you look at the reference, it's all shaded in. If it's not stark white, there should be some sort of shade. It just brings the lighting more so to that side of the face rather than the left like it does in the reference. I do really like the shades that he has in this tattoo. They are super smooth. I just think he took a little liberty with the direction in which those hairs were flowing. And it being a precision challenge, you really gotta follow the reference. I do feel like the whiskers are a bit pronounced in the tattoo because when we look at the reference, there is some sort of shade there. They are not stark white. So to me, I feel like it just pulls a little too much attention to those whiskers. The darker triangle in the background, I think is a really good idea to bring some darkness in around all these lighter shades. But if we look up to the top, that black isn't that well saturated. And I know it's not that big of a deal in this tattoo. I know the main focus should be the face, but personally I'm a stickler for technicals. And while we're up here, I did notice that the triangle is a lot smaller than it is on the reference, so I don't know if Joseph made some last minute alterations, but again, not that big of a deal. So overall, really not a bad tattoo. I just think my biggest gripe is the overuse and changing of the light source. If any of you out there are getting into portraits, you really have to pay attention to light and shadow and know exactly where they're hitting, because that can change a face completely. But good job, Joseph. Up next, we've got James with the Chocolate Lab Nipper. Now, being a portrait guy, I gotta say I'm not super thrilled with this one. It does look like a good tattoo overall, but when we compare it to the reference, there are so many differences that I understand why he was in the bottom. I think the biggest mistake here was not using enough of that chocolate brown, especially up in that snout area. James just left too much skin open when there should have been a few tones of brown. I do think the reference is super cool, and I like how James tried to add those extra elements of those negative space bubbles. Doing a lot of shiny and metallic things, I do think he missed the mark on the bubble as well, but that is a very difficult part of this tattoo. I do think there is a lack of shades when it comes to the right of the snout and even on that upper ear. It just seems like he didn't put enough hair in there. Color portraits are a hard thing to do, especially when it comes to animals, and even more especially when it comes to just doing it in 6 hours. So I have to commend James on even taking a swing at this, because in color this is a very hard thing to do. But I know the client is happy, and in the end that's all that matters. Up next we've got Jade and Whiskey, and at first glance, without looking at the reference, this tattoo looks a little odd, and I'm not sure why. But as soon as we pop the reference up in there, I mean, it looks almost identical to the reference. I've looked this thing over a ton, and the only real difference I see is the sharpness of the teeth, which if that's the only complaint, really not a bad job. The eyes are stark and damn near perfect. I do think it could have used a little more texture, especially up in the face, give it a little more of that salt and pepper look. So I do think the portrait is great, I just think the shape of the oval is really throwing this thing off. A diamond would have been cool. I do think this portrait probably would have been better off without any shape at all. Or if she was going to use any kind of shape, just move that dog a little more outside of the frame, more than it already is. It just gives this tattoo an overall crowded and odd shape. But as far as precision goes, she nailed it, and I'm sure the owner is more than happy. Up next, we've got Lucy and JJ. Now this one did put Lucy in the bottom too, and there's a couple reasons why. Now I gotta say, I do really love the addition of the petal on JJ's nose, but it does get a little lost. And when it comes to the daisies, I almost wish she left those out entirely, because they do have an overall unfinished look. You can put 6 to 8 hours in this dog portrait alone, and that wouldn't really leave you enough time to finish those flowers. You can always add them later. It does feel like this tattoo is all only one tone. There's some blacks and one shade of gray. If we look at the reference, there's this large triangular white spot, and it doesn't really show up in the tattoo. I'm also not a fan of this dark black spot on the side of the ear. I wish that was fanned out just a bit more. It does look like Lucy added some stark whites to the eyes, and they're not really there in the reference, so I'm not sure if Lucy just wanted our attention to go to those eyes, but it does look like the dog is crying. Again, I just think if Lucy didn't put those flowers in the bottom, she could have used a lot more of her time in the dog and made this thing a lot more readable. But the nose is probably one of the more realistic noses in the entire group. Overall, not bad. I just think this one needed a lot more time.
All right, real quick, I want to take a break and give a shout out to the sponsor of our channel, Mad Rabbit. Mad Rabbit is a tattoo aftercare company that has something for everyone. Whether you're a new tattooer or a longtime veteran, they've got you covered. So head on over to madrabbit.com and check out all they have to offer. And be sure to use code PONY20 to save 20% off your entire order. All right, let's get back to it.
Up next, we've got my tattoo, and I was tasked with tattooing Starling. Now, I will say that I do honestly think I had the hardest ask in the room. A black poodle with all that hair on Precision Day? Good grief. Animal portraits alone are already hard enough. Add all this fur to it, phew. I do wish I had more time to add darker shades here and there, like in the ear and on the head, but as I said before, time is my biggest enemy in this competition. But that's no excuse. She did mention she wanted a colored portrait, but there's not really any other colors besides black and white in this thing, and I knew I could accomplish a black and white portrait a lot faster than I could a colored one. I was super stoked when they mentioned it was portrait day, but when I got tasked this black poodle, I was slightly less than excited. This was the one tattoo in the room that I thought would be the most difficult by far. All this curly hair, all this texture in 6 hours is a task. My client had 5 photos that the producers helped pick, but 4 of them were super blurry, and this was the only one that was semi-clear. I know it's not that riveting of a photo, but I think I pulled it off. Personally, I think it's easier to pull off a good-looking tattoo when you have a great reference, and that can be said about any tattoo. Now, I'm not making excuses for myself here because I think I did an okay job, but on portrait day, I wish I had a little bit better reference. But that being said, Starling was a blessing to be able to hang out with all day. Let's see what's next. Up next, we've got Trevor and Buttons. Now, I will say that Trevor did an extremely good job on this tattoo, and some things did get a little bit warped, but that's because it's sitting on top of the shoulder. And this is the type of reference I'm talking about. This picture has great personality. There's lots of nice darks, lots of nice whites. So in the end, I think it would make for a better looking tattoo. And Trevor killed this thing. He went huge. I don't think going huge is always necessary or the smartest choice, but he put a lot into this tattoo. I do think this tattoo would look a little less warped if it were or not as big and maybe move down a bit, but that's just my opinion. Now, a lot of us were giving him guff on set because we were saying that this thing was backwards, a lot like his samurai hand from last episode. And I get why he didn't flip it. He didn't want this dog to look like it was from a parallel universe, but this dog is really symmetrical, so I don't see why he just didn't flip it. It's not that big of a deal, honestly, but I think it would have looked a little bit better had it been flipped the other way. And I know you can't really tell in the photo of the tattoo, but the person is facing to the right. So personally, I wish those two front paws were on the right-hand side as well. That being said, Trevor managed to put a lot of good texture into this tattoo and really capture this dog's personality. He didn't overdo it on the skin tones, and he didn't overdo it on the whites. He only put them where they belong. The bottom legs do look a little weird because of the shadows. I think those shadowy areas could have been separated a little more. But at this point, I'm nitpicking because he did manage to get all the right shapes. The tags look great as well, even though they are lacking detail, which is fine because our focus isn't supposed to go to the tags. It's supposed to go to that adorable little dog face.
Can I pet that dog?
No.
Can I pet that dog?
No.
Can I pet that dog?
No, he's
Can I
sleeping.
pet that dog?
And I think picking this reference was a smart decision. Because of that blurry background, you don't really have to focus a lot on details with the background and the body, but you can put that time up into the face where it belongs. So great job, Trevor. You did this dog justice. Up next, we've got Stephanie and Vespa. Now with this portrait, I'm seeing a lot of the same issues as I saw with some others, and that's overuse of skin tone. Like if we look between the eyes and to the right of the snout, we're seeing a lot of skin tone that's not really there in the reference. There are actually very light shades. Having those light shades in those areas just really flatten out the face because you want those lighter areas to just be on the snout, so it really pulls it forward. We're seeing the same sort of thing happen below the nose as well. There's just a lot of skin tone in there that's not in the reference. And I will say with this tattoo, I probably would have went a little smaller as well. I just think it has some warping, especially around the ears because of the size. It's not that big of an issue, especially when you see it in person, but as far as the picture goes, I do think it could have gone a little smaller. I did notice on the tattoo that the collar is different, and I'm not sure if that was the client's decision or not. It doesn't really affect the overall tattoo or the critique. It's just something I wanted to point out. But I do think it helped out because you can now add the name tag a little bit closer to the face. I do wish there was a little more black shading to the right of the mouth because as the tattoo sits, it's really pulling that part of the face forward when that should be pushed back. I do like the eyes. There's not an overuse of white, and overall, this is a very solid tattoo. This does look damn near identical to the dog, even though I wished it was a little smaller. Now, as we know, James and Lucy ended up in the bottom. But they had a second chance to redeem themselves, which personally, this far into the competition is kind of crazy, but it is what it is. The caveat being, whatever artist they challenged got to pick the style and subject matter. Lucy called out Joseph, and James called out Trevor. I think James was still sour about that backwards hand. Joseph decided to go with a black and gray panda with graffiti elements. And Trevor weirdly went with black and gray realism skull and rose. If I were Trevor, that's not what I would have picked. I probably would have went with another black and gray dog. It seems like James struggled with this one and Trevor had the opportunity to strike. But before we get into Trevor and James, let's check out Joseph's tattoo. Now this is a very aggressive looking panda, but my first thought would be is this belongs on a leg. It wraps way too much to be on a forearm. I think we'd see the tattoo as a whole if it were on a thigh. As the judges said, they wished Joseph would have brought some of that green down into the tattoo as well, rather than just the top, and I have to agree. Letters alone draw our eyes immediately, and it being the only piece of color in this tattoo, we're not really looking at the panda's face. Having some green at the bottom or even in the panda's eye would have really helped this thing out a lot. The nostrils are different sizes, and I'm not sure if that was in the reference or not, but it does catch my attention. The weird pokey eyebrow on the right side is a little off-putting. It just looks strange and out of place, and I'm not sure why it's only on that eye. I don't think this is a bad tattoo by any means, and this style is right up his alley, but I think he chose the wrong person to go for panda and graffiti, because Lucy's red panda is stellar. And she mentioned that graffiti is something she used to do a lot of. Just the fact that they both decided to put the word panda in their tattoos in their respective languages is hilarious. I absolutely love all the little elements that Lucy decided to add into her tattoo. The little heart bubble at the top and the little red panda at the bottom. Just super cool. The blues around the graffiti and the blues in the background really keep this thing balanced. The one thing I'm not the biggest fan of are these leaves. I almost wish they were more graphic and just one or two solid colors. The whiskers look great, the hair looked great, the nose looks great. I think Joseph was trying to trip her up because her dog wasn't that great. But she knocked this one out of the park. Now I'm not gonna say who went home on this one, but you can make an educated guess. Let's check out James and Trevor's. Now with Trevor's tattoo, this rose is immaculate. He set a really high bar with this one. The skull did fall a little flat. I do like the bottom more than the top. I know in Trevor's a reference, above the nose had a lot more skin tone, and I think this is where he started the rush because he put a lot of time into the bottom, and you can tell. But I love the shapes of the leaves and even those little lines in the leaves. It just adds a really nice texture. I liked how he decided to go for an animal skull rather than a human skull because that would have been too on the nose. But the composition is great, and overall I think he did a pretty solid job, especially for having to perform again. Now when it comes to James's tattoo, something that only a few of us know is when he went to make his stencil for this tattoo, he put his stencil on the same layer as the reference, which means his stencil and reference were all combined into one. He couldn't separate them. So for the most part, he was just going out of his head. But the name of the game here is realism, so going out of your head is a very tricky move. James's rose definitely fell a lot more flat when you compare it next to Trevor's, but Trevor did have an amazing looking rose. That's a hard one to beat. James's skull is a lot more readable because he didn't go overboard with the texture. The texture that he has there is really nice, because sometimes by adding too much texture, you can really muddy up an image. The top rosebud does fall a little flat for me as well, and I think that's because he used a little too much shading. I think something that's sitting in the front like that could have benefited from using more skin tone. For somebody who does black and gray on the regular, this was a very close call for me. Trevor and James had some good elements, but also had a lot of strange elements as well. So again, I'm not gonna spoil it if you haven't seen the episode. You just gotta go watch it and see for yourself. So that's gonna wrap this one up, guys. Please go follow all the artists on the season because they all are fantastic in their own right. Don't forget you can watch Ink Master Season 16 every Wednesday on Paramount+. Don't forget to subscribe while you're here, and as always, I will see you guys next week.